Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This week's questions answered video. What are my thoughts on the Castile shooting? Questions like this are difficult to answer because I wasn't there to answer objectively anyway. Of course, opinions are exactly that. They're opinions, facts are a little bit different. The officer in question went to trial and was acquitted. He was tried by a jury of his peers, and the evidence presented convinced them beyond a reasonable doubt that he was not guilty of a crime. Outside of that, though, I think the bigger problem, I wouldn't say it's a systemic problem, but it is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed in law enforcement, is the issue of training officers or reinforcing training of officers on how to deal with lawfully armed individuals. Castile had a CCW. Now, the facts after that aren't really the topic of what I'm talking about. I don't want to use that one shooting under a microscope as an example of the good and the bad, or the things that need to be definitely changed, or the things that need to stay the same. What I will say is just my own personal polling of my circle of peers, officers that I know, as well as officers that I've interacted with online, is there seems to be a huge disparity, and it's almost regional, on what officers receive in-service training on how to interact with lawfully armed individuals. That is a travesty of training. In certain states where historically citizens are not allowed to carry concealed weapons, such as, you look at Manhattan, New York, and even some parts of California, New Jersey, so on and so forth, the less free states, then maybe that training isn't going to be such a big issue, because CCW carry is just lawfully armed citizens just isn't a thing. Whether you agree with it or not, the state says, no, you may not carry a concealed weapon, or they make it very difficult for you to carry a concealed weapon, so it's unlikely for an officer to encounter a lawfully armed individual. Other states where open carry is really huge, or states that just recently got open carry, such as Texas, there have been some recent, from officers I've talked to that work in states like that, there have been some recent information put out to officers, best practices, principles on how to deal with open carry lawfully armed individual, or when they've had open carry rallies, talking to officers and how to interact with those situations in the event that they had to make a contact with a person that was lawfully carrying a firearm. But outside of that, outside of those specific circumstances, there does seem to be a significant lack, just to my opinion, of training officers on how to interact with lawfully armed individuals. If you work in law enforcement and you're a police officer and your department isn't providing any sort of training on how to deal with lawfully armed individuals, your department is doing you a significant disservice. It's negligence, especially if you work in a state where CCWs are common. Here in Georgia, CCW is very common. Arizona, other states like that, Texas, CCWs exist. Your department has a duty to you as an officer to make sure that you have the proper training to interact in those environments. Granted, most of the focus goes elsewhere, and that's understood. If your department doesn't have the budget to provide training on how to deal with lawfully armed individuals, but I really can't agree with, because it's not like you physically have to, force-on-force scenarios are obviously great. And I know some people who've had force-on-force scenarios in their police academy where there was a scenario where they were dealing with a lawfully armed individual, and that's excellent training. But if your department simply doesn't have the means to provide that, the very least they could do is put together a 1 or 2 hour block of instruction that's part of your in-service training that says, okay, here's some good practices, principles on how to deal with someone who's lawfully armed. If you pull someone over for a moving violation, the fact that they're lawfully armed shouldn't really factor into that moving violation, especially if they're 100% compliant. Some states have a duty to inform, like Ohio is a good example, like let the guy know, hey, I have a concealed weapons permit. At that point, what is your department's policy on how to deal with that weapon? Me personally, I do a traffic stop, someone's lawfully armed, you don't touch yours, I won't touch mine. There's no need for me to take control of that weapon given the reason for the stop. I don't need to turn this into something that it's not. The person may have committed a traffic infraction, but the fact that they're lawfully armed shouldn't really factor into the way that I deal with that stop, because the only reason that they were stopped, the only reason I have them, is because they've committed a minor infraction. I don't need to develop or exaggerate or exacerbate the situation just based on the fact that they lawfully possess a firearm. The key word there is lawfully. Do you really have good conscience to take control of their firearm? And what's more, should you, in good conscience, introduce another firearm into a situation which otherwise it would stay in its holster, concealed, or wherever it's kept in the vehicle? As long as you understand where it is and they're not in current control of it, as it's not in their hand, I don't really see it as such a large issue. Of course, officer safety is going to come up. In states where there is no duty to inform, people get pulled over, they have a CCW, they're carrying a concealed weapon, they never once informed the officer that they had that concealed weapon. So if you didn't know it was there, and the stop would have resolved itself peacefully anyway because the individual is lawfully armed and you're literally just going to give them an infraction or a warning or what have you, then do we really need to make such a big deal out of it just because we know it exists? Now, believe me, I understand officer safety. I was a training officer for a police department for years. I understand that officer safety is built into a lot of the things that we do, a lot of our policies, a lot of our practices, and that makes perfect sense. But officer safety is mitigation or control of risk. It is not removal of risk. And you have to actually identify that a risk is present. Cops are used to being around guns, but we're usually used to being around our own gun and the guns of fellow officers. So an inexperienced officer, an officer who hasn't had a lot of training, may not know quite how to deal with a lawfully armed individual. And that goes back to, again, the department has a responsibility, especially in states where CCWs are very common, to ensure that their officers understand that that weapon is lawfully possessed and there's no reason outside of an actual factual probable cause reason to take control of that weapon. Now, is there anything wrong necessarily with taking control of that weapon? That's up for the states to decide. That's up for the courts to decide. I personally don't see any reason whatsoever, absent an actual probable cause reason, to take control of a lawfully armed weapon or lawfully possessed weapon from an individual who's being stopped for something that is immaterial to the weapon itself. I don't see how that benefits any of us, not only from a safety standpoint, but from a public perception standpoint. And say what you will, public perception is going to drive policy. I think any officer can agree with the fact that if they've been a cop long enough, they've seen how public perception has created policies that either make your job harder or they create issues that wouldn't have otherwise existed. So if any of you watching are law enforcement, if any of you watching are law enforcement training officers or field training officers, especially the FTOs in departments where training, the in-service training doesn't address this, what is your default technique or default policy for dealing with a lawfully armed citizen? Do you honestly have one, or you just kind of play every situation by ear? What is your standard operating procedure going to be when you interact with a person who informs you like, hey, just want to let you know I have a concealed weapons permit, I do have a firearm in the vehicle? At that point, where do you go from there? Granted, the nature of the stop is going to determine to a wide degree how you handle something, but again, if it's a simple traffic violation, tail lights out, license plate lamp is out, ran a red light, what have you. If the crime itself isn't violent in nature, or if the infraction itself isn't violent in nature, then of course that would, to me, at least as an officer, change the way that I'm going to deal with the situation. It's going to be a pretty straightforward situation. You don't touch yours, I won't touch mine. I'm going to want to know where it is, and I'm going to want to make sure it stays where it is. That's pretty simple. Don't be linguistically lazy when we're asking for things. On the other side of the coin, if someone gets pulled over, then obviously they probably know through either being pulled over in the past or interacting with other officers, or just from television. One of the things television usually gets right is license, registration, proof of insurance. Have that stuff ready to go. That way, if you do interact with an officer who has no training on how to deal with a lawfully armed individual, you don't make him unduly nervous. Because the presence of a firearm in a vehicle may make that officer nervous. It shouldn't. He should be comfortable with the idea, especially in places where CCWs are common, but you can't guarantee. You don't know the level of training that is walking up to your vehicle. You do not know the level of experience that is walking up to your vehicle. As an officer, if the presence of a firearm, absent any reason to believe that the firearm is a threat to you, is in a vehicle, makes you nervous, you have to ask yourself why. Is it from a lack of training, or do you have some kind of cognitive bias against people who carry firearms for self-protection? I would like to think that officers with that mentality would be in a severe minority, but I can't say for certain, because even though I know a lot of cops, I only know a very, very small fraction of the officers that are on the job every day in the U.S. So at the end of the day, the two people need to address this topic: the citizens who carry lawfully and the police officers who may interact with a lawfully carried firearm. And I keep coming back to that because both sides need to be on the same page as much as possible. Obviously, you can't dictate policy to a police department that doesn't have one in existence, but if your police department doesn't have some kind of SOP or policy for this, you have to ask yourself why, because we have policies for every single other thing that law enforcement does. Why not this? There should be some kind of standard operating procedure. And if you're in a position to influence that, then do so. If you need to write a justification letter or whatever your department calls it, or you need to talk to your training officer, talk to your shift supervisor, do something in roll call. Do anything you can to change what isn't being done. If you already have a good program in place, including force on force, where occasionally a lawfully armed citizen scenario gets introduced, that's awesome. We have to know what we're dealing with before we decide that a weapon is actually a threat to us or not. Sometimes those situations are literally split-second decisions, and sometimes we know well ahead of time how things can go if we just treat this person with, if not a respect for them, which they do respect given, but a respect for the fact that the weapon is lawfully possessed, and we shouldn't treat them like a criminal or treat them like a threat absent other facts just because they have a firearm. That's not that big of a deal. Yes, officer safety, and I get that. But if I pulled a guy over for, his blinkers out, and then he tells me he has a lawfully possessed firearm, that's not really going to change the way I'm interacting with him, because it's given me no more facts. He's just a guy who happens to lawfully carry a firearm for self-defense. You're just a police officer who happens to lawfully carry a firearm for self-defense. It's really that simple. That's kind of my thoughts on the topic. Granted, this is a very nebulous topic. We can go on and on and on and look at it from a bunch of different ways. And I think those are conversations that need to be had. It's unfortunate that this conversation had to take place with the guy losing his life. But if nothing else, hopefully we can take something from that and make everybody safer. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.